Mr. President, in many ways, Andrew Wheeler is a perfect example of cabinet appointment in the Trump era, conflicted, unethical, and hostile to the mission of the agency he was nominated to lead. He shouldn't have been confirmed to his position as Deputy Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and he certainly shouldn't be confirmed to lead the agency on a permanent basis. Prior to his service at EPA, Mr. Wheeler spent 8 years lobbying for many of the special interests that he is targeted or charged with regulating. For example, in his work for Murray Energy, whose president, Robert Murray, was among the largest donors to Donald Trump's 2016 campaign, Mr. Wheeler worked to kill a rule that would have prevented coal companies from dumping mining waste into American streams and waterways. As a lobbyist for Murray Energy, Mr. Wheeler also fought tooth and nail against President Obama's Clean Power Plan, a forward-looking initiative that would have substantially reduced carbon emissions from power generation. Mr. Wheeler's client, Robert Murray, was present front and center as former EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt signed an executive order to begin the process of dismantling the Clean Power Plan. I don't think that was a coincidence. After Mr. Wheeler's confirmation as the EPA's Deputy Administrator, he assured Bloomberg News in June 2018 that, quote, "If I lobbied on something, I don't think it's appropriate for me to participate in policymaking," end quote. Of course, he was lobbying on a lot of things for 8 years. In fact, Mr. Wheeler participated in meetings with 3 former clients with interests before the EPA. Holding these meetings with former clients is a clear conflict of interest and ethical lapse. Andrew Wheeler fits right in with Donald Trump's version of draining the swamp, which is more like, come on in, the water's fine. We've already had one EPA administrator, Scott Pruitt, resign in disgrace over ethical lapses and potentially illegal behavior in office. We don't need another. Mr. Wheeler's work at the EPA is also consistent with the hostility of Trump cabinet officials to the core mission of the department or agency that they are appointed to lead. The EPA is the primary agency charged with safeguarding the environment and protecting public health from dangerous and toxic chemicals. At its core, the EPA is tasked with making sure we have safe air to breathe and clean water to drink. Yet, during his time as Deputy Administrator, Mr. Wheeler has championed a deregulatory agenda that fundamentally undermines the EPA's core mission. Under Mr. Wheeler's leadership, the EPA has proposed undermining the legal authority of the mercury and air toxics standard to reduce emissions of mercury and other toxic air emissions from coal and oil burning power plants. According to the Union of Concerned Scientists, mercury exposure can damage the nervous system, digestive and immune systems, and is a serious threat to child development. The EPA's current efforts to reverse these emissions standards in place since 2012 come after utilities across the country had already invested resources in reducing mercury emissions by 90%. Under Mr. Wheeler's leadership, the Trump administration has also proposed a dramatic weakening of fuel economy and greenhouse gas emissions standards for cars. Their proposed rule would increase air pollution from vehicles and would result in, for Hawaii families, ending up paying thousands more dollars for gasoline to fill less efficient cars. Through his opposition to the Clean Power Plan and his efforts to repeal it at the EPA, Mr. Wheeler serves as a primary architect of the Trump administration's assault on climate science and their refusal to act decisively against climate change. This assault can also be seen in a new proposed rule from the EPA that would exclude rigorous, peer-reviewed scientific studies under the guise of promoting scientific transparency. At first glance, the rule sounds like something everyone should support. But like so many initiatives proposed by this administration, the rule's true intent is much more sinister. Insisting that policymaking rely only on studies that make all of their data public would exclude studies that rely on confidential medical information that by law cannot be made public. Limiting the factual basis on which the EPA can make decisions in this manner would have a catastrophic impact on public health. If this rule had been in effect in 1993, the 6 cities study by the Harvard School of Public Health would never have transformed the way we regulate air pollution in this country. The studies show that Americans living in cities with more air pollution have shorter lifespans than Americans living in cities with less air pollution. Using confidential medical information, the study conclusively demonstrated that fine particulate matter that is smaller than 2.5 microns is exceptionally deadly to human beings. These findings, which have been backed up in subsequent studies, provide the basis for cost-benefit analysis done by EPA for future rules regulating air pollution. Undermining this kind of evidence-based policymaking would give industry the green light to pollute with fewer consequences. This proposed rule is consistent with an administration-wide effort to promote ignorance in the face of the real threat climate change poses to national security, public health, and public safety. Climate change is an issue where ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance is dangerous. The president's own top national security officials agree. Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats, for example, issued a new worldwide threat assessment that concluded that climate hazards like extreme weather, wildfires, droughts, and acidifying oceans are, to quote Dan Coats, threatening infrastructure, health, and water, and food security, end quote. In 2017, then Secretary of Defense James Mattis told the Senate Armed Services Committee that, quote, climate change is impacting stability in areas of the world where our troops are operating. He went on to say climate change is a challenge that requires a broader, whole-of-government response, end quote. Instead of accepting the conclusions of his top national security officials, Donald Trump is following the recommendation of William Happer, a notorious climate denier and now a senior director on the NSC, to establish a new presidential committee on climate security. Dr. Happer is particularly notorious for his assertion that, quote, the demonization of carbon dioxide is just like the demonization of the poor Jews under Hitler. Carbon dioxide is actually a benefit to the world, and so were the Jews, end quote. Anyone who makes this kind of outrageous analogy should not be entrusted to lead anything on climate security, in my view. No one should doubt that the president and Dr. Happer have a preordained outcome in mind. They want to legitimize ignorance and denial of climate change and abandon tens of millions of Americans to the disastrous impact of climate change in the coming decades. I repeat, with climate change, ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance is dangerous. It's dangerous for a state like Hawaii that will be among the hardest hit by the impacts of climate change. Indeed, with extreme weather, ocean acidification, coral bleaching, and rising seas, climate change poses an existential threat to our state. It's one of the reasons Hawaii has implemented some of the most ambitious and aggressive policies to combat climate change in the country. Hawaii was the first state to separately ratify the Paris Climate Agreement and has set an ambitious goal of becoming carbon neutral and generating 100% of our power from renewable sources by 2045. Hawaii's ambitious effort to confront climate change and the success we've already seen in moving forward with our goals demonstrates that we can embrace similarly ambitious policies at the national level. It's one of the reasons I've signed on as a co-sponsor of the Green New Deal, an aspirational effort to transform our economy to combat climate change. In the weeks since the plan we introduced, we've endured all kinds of mocking outrage from people who would rather stick their heads in the sand as science and fact deniers. They paint the Green New Deal as something scary and dangerous for the country. What's really scary and dangerous are people like them who deny that climate change is real and refuse to do anything about it in their steadfast support and alliance with the fossil fuel industry. History will not be kind to them. And rejecting the nomination of Andrew Wheeler to serve as the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, we can take one step forward in the fight against dangerous ignorance. Mr. President, I yield the floor.